In this video, we're going to take the web hierarchical data source that we've created in a previous video, which essentially mimics a couple of the entities found within the Microsoft Northwind sample database, and we're going to take this web hierarchical data source and hook it up to the Infragistics Net Advantage for ASP.NET Web Hierarchical Data Grid. So essentially the Web Hierarchical Data Grid is designed to represent and visualize hierarchical data that has multiple levels and entities that are related together. Now, one of the things you may be asking is, why do we have two different grids? We have a web hierarchical data grid and we also have a web data grid. Well, essentially Infragistics decided to create two separate controls. One of them allows you to work with just plain old flat data if you don't have a hierarchical data source, or if you just have a plain old list of objects where you don't have child collections amongst each entity. And this is a good idea because you're not going to incur the extra overhead of all that engineering and feature capability of a grid that could do absolutely everything within one control. So if you work with a flat data source, you work with the web data grid. If you have hierarchical data source, you can work with the web hierarchical data grid. However, if you have flat data and you wish to use the Outlook group by functionality that you find on all of the Infragistics grids, then you go with the web hierarchical data grid because it has the ability to represent hierarchical data and create hierarchical data out of a flat data source if you go that route. So to get started, I'm going to add the web hierarchical data grid to my form, and the next thing I'm going to do is use the smart tag to select the web hierarchical data source that's on my form right now. The grid is prompting me with this dialog. Essentially, this is asking to generate all of the columns and bands from the data source. So it's going to walk the data source and it's going to create one column for each public property of each entity as well as bands for each entity. You may hear the word band being used a lot within Infragistics vernacular. That essentially represents a level within the grid, or think of it as an entity. So this grid will have three bands. The parentmost band is the customer, underneath that is the order entity, and then the third one in will be the order details. So one of the first things after setting the data source that I'd like to do is click on Edit Bands. So you want to click on Edit Bands. That's going to launch the designer. The most important thing you want to do within this step is to ensure that each band has the correct data key fields property set. So essentially you want to make sure that the primary key of each one of your entities is correctly assigned to the data key fields property. So customer gets customer ID, orders gets order ID, and when I click on order details, we notice that it's blank. So this may happen in the event where you have a composite primary key, or a key that consists of two separate keys. So the uniqueness of the order details is achieved by the order ID, and then you use a comma delimited list when you want to list more than one. So you have order ID and product ID. And we click on OK. And the other thing I want to do real quick, I would like to just remove the width of the grid so that we get to see the entire thing without having to scroll over. So let's click on save and run it, and let's just see what we get right now. Okay, so everything compiles for the first time and it loads up, and then we have our grid. So I'm able to scroll through the entire initial list, and because of a property setting on the grid called initial band depth, it is set to 0, which means that the initial band depth that is populated on this grid is the first one, the first band, or the sub-0 band in the band collection. It means that the rest of the levels don't exist, so you have to expand each one in order to load them on demand. So if I click on this, the child records for that one entity are loaded, and then let's click on this one here, and we'll get the child records for that one. So a request is made to the server, the access database file is touched, and then we get the child records here. And we have our scroll bar to the side. We could also set this to 100% if we wanted to, so in order to see everything, but we just did it this way. Now because we have hierarchical data, in this control, you could do other things. Like for example, let me go and click on Edit Behaviors. So this is where you can go to enable all these other behaviors such as activation and editing. So whenever you hear the word behaviors used within the context of infragistics controls, essentially it means the interactive points or the types of interactive functionalities that we expose through the control, through property settings. By you checking these checkboxes behind the scenes, objects are being created and added to the definition of the control in the markup. So if you don't check something, you don't incur the expense of these objects existing within your page. So that's another nice architectural advancement that Infragistics has made within our controls. Now if I select deleting, I'm getting prompted to also enable selection, and I have to enable that if I want row deleting, because if you cannot select one or many records, the grid doesn't know which row you want to delete. And I'll just turn everything on and click apply and OK. And again, the great thing about this is that we can access events off of the data source controls that we use. In the previous video, we showed you how to build up the web hierarchical data source, which essentially is composed of 3 separate access data source controls, each one pointing to an entity within a Microsoft Access database file, and they're all tied together to form a database-like relationship within the context of this page. And now, in order, if you wish to enable the create, read, update, and delete functionality within the grid, you can access all of these entities and their events through the actual individual data source controls. So if you could essentially wire up any of these data source events such as deleting or deleted, and you could pretty much write whatever code that you normally would in here and access the event arguments and all that. So you could do all this like you normally would when you're writing data access code. So once I enable all these, we can just run it again just to see what it looks like. And now the page loads, and here we have the grid that's loaded with all of our columns and all of our entities. So most of the behaviors that I've selected will be enabled only for the first band. Some of them are not going to be enabled for the subsequent child bands, and that's done in an interest for performance. And also, if you want this to be enabled, you simply go through each individual band to its behaviors collection and enable each one of the behaviors that you wish to cascade down to each band. So thanks for watching.
Infragistics. On the web at infragistics.com.